First, I'll pull up the midterm. Um, so if you guys get 32 wrong, you get like 8 points knocked because I actually gave it to you. So if I get there and you're like, it's whatever, I'll be like, no, you actually got the answer in class. Um, so let me pull, and it'll be in Canvas. A lot of people had emailed saying that they like in paper too. So I was like, okay. Uh, So the first is just true or false. So you just go through true, false. The multiple choice, pretty straightforward. So the other piece is identifying the legal or ethical issue involved in the following examples. So 32 is the example that we talked about. So this scenario is a client comes in for their first session. The clinical social worker reviews limits of confidentiality, fees, and educational background to the client. So that would be informed consent. So that's part of informed consent where we give them our background, fees, different things like that. So with these scenarios, there should be things like that in the PowerPoint that you can go through and be like, oh, that's what he's talking about. So you would just put informed consent there. You could expand more if you'd like this is part of informed consent, but you don't have to. It's up to you.
So like if it's scope outside.
Yeah, scope of practice, scope of competency. So if you think like scope of competency is what do we have education, experience, training on to treat. Scope of practice is what legally can we treat. Most of the answers, pretty much all of them, you can find in the PowerPoint. The reason I do those pieces is because sometimes people, when they're given examples, they don't really know how to apply it. So you just go through. Maybe I'll do like an example so that you guys understand not just but legal, ethical, or both. The last part is where you just write, is this legal, is this ethical, or is this legal and ethical? And just go off the PowerPoint. Sometimes people use Google and it's not always correct. So just go off the PowerPoint and the text. 'Cause that's what I'm basing the information on. And that's pretty much it. So, and then, like I said, once everyone submits it, then I can let everyone see what they got wrong. But I want to wait till everyone submits the test before we do that. And there won't be a portion that's short answer because that's enough. And the paper will be more of kind of like the theory and the decision-making approaches and that kind of thing. Yeah.
You said 32, you basically gave it to us?
Mm-hmm.
Is that just through like the PowerPoint and the lectures?
Well, no, I literally told you what it is. It's informed consent.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So that's the one, if you get that one, then I'm going to be like, really?
I just want to make sure I didn't miss it since you had said that.
Yeah, no, I was just joking with you guys. But yeah, I mean, that, because I want to give an example, so that one we'll just use it. It's 32 is informed consent. So you're basically just connecting it with what is happening in that example. And I do consider, I look at it, so if you have one that I could kind of see, that's where sometimes explaining a little bit can be helpful, because if I can kind of see where you're going, then I'm okay with that. If I see that you're getting portions of it or whatever. So today is child abuse, and one thing I told the Riverside cohort, and I'll tell you guys as well, a lot of you guys, especially in Riverside, they've been in the field for a long time. You've been in child welfare. So if there's anything where you're like, that's not true, just say it. I won't be like, no. Mention that. Because with APS, I haven't been in APS for 8 years. So I'm sure there's a lot of things that have changed. Same with CPS, it's been quite a few years. So anything when I'm going through it, it's not like that's it. Usually what I do if I'm wrong, because that does happen, shockingly, just kidding, is I usually want to double check to make sure, go through whatever the text or whatever to make sure that that's supported. So today we're mainly looking at child abuse and neglect and family law. The syllabus also had consent for minors and release of information for minors, but we already kind of covered it in previous weeks. So I didn't feel like I needed to just re-put what we already covered. So this helps us kind of understand what is child abuse and neglect, what are our legal mandates, and what are we looking for, what's considered reasonable suspicion, things of that nature. So all we have to have is reasonable suspicion. And it's pretty gray. Basically, you're covered. If you have reasonable suspicion, you're good. You don't have to prove why you have reasonable suspicion. You just need to say, there was a weird mark, or the kid was acting funny, or the kid told me, part of this, but not the other part. Then you call it in. When you call in a report, you call the hotline. Make sure you get the report number, the person that you talk to, and then you fax it in within 36 hours. What I would highly suggest is you do it right then. Because if something happens, like it's Friday, you don't write that much because there's not that much to it. And you're like, I don't know, you come in and everything explodes, you might not need that. So I find it personally easier just to call it in, do it, send it in, and not have to worry about it again. But technically you have 36 hours to submit the written report. So physical abuse is injury to a minor or any kind of cruel or inhumane corporal punishment. If a parent disciplines a child physically but does not leave a mark or bruise, it would not be considered abusive. So lawful corporal punishment, you can spank your kids. So that's, a lot of times people will come out, I know the law. It's like, you are right. You can spank your kids. It's not suggested. But once you leave a mark, that becomes unlawful corporal punishment. So you want to educate parents, if they do say that, yes, that's true, but I want to make sure you understand if you do leave a mark, that's when it could cause issues. Police come out, all kinds of people come out, because sometimes people don't know that. Generally, historically, the way our society's kind of viewed families is you keep everything within the family, people don't interrupt or get involved, so it's helpful to educate people if that's occurring. If some exceptions to physical abuse are physical force used by law enforcement to control a situation. So you know how that goes. Whatever that happens, as long as they can say it's to control the situation, they're good. School officials, if they use physical force to remove weapons or other dangerous objects from a client, so, high school age, middle school age, maybe even elementary, if they have to restrain kid, they have to, pretty much just restraining them. That is not considered physical abuse. Mutual fighting between youth the same age would not be considered physical abuse either. So you're not going to call in because the kid comes in and says, I got in a fist fight with Johnny. What you're looking at with physical abuse, if it is a fight, is a big age differential, maybe development, maybe at the same age that one person is severely delayed, that would probably be an issue. So you can think of that, but generally speaking, fist fights, we're not going to call in. So sexual abuse, there's two kinds of sexual abuse. There's sexual assault, so that's incest, so sexual relationships between family members, oral sex, anal sex, sexual penetration, lewd and lascivious acts, child molestation, and some forms of statutory rape. So that is actual sexual assault. Sexual exploitation is when a parent encourages the child to participate in sexually explicit acts, performances, or depictions, and or allows them to happen. So that kind of hits both caregivers. If one parent's sexually abusing them and the other one's like, well, I didn't do it, but you knew what was going on. Mm-hmm.
It can be, we're not talking about
You can call it in. They can always, again, reasonable suspicion is all you need. So there are circumstances, if there's if it's, if a 5-year-old's, penetrating people, that's not normal sex play for a 5-year-old. That would be an indication that something happened. If they're playing doctor, that's okay, but once you get into, oral sex, 5-year-olds don't know what that is. So if you have reasonable suspicion, you can call it in. If you think that this is not appropriate given their age, the amount of knowledge the kid has about sex. So some of the indicators
potentially that someone's had sexual abuse is might become hypersexual. So they're very fixated on sex, body parts, masturbation. Again, you have to think about development. So when people hit a certain age, they might be fixated, but it would be more than the average. It can also be situations where they totally avoid their genitals. Like there's like an aversion to them. So, like if you, let's say, there's a kid that's potty training. Like I remember actually someone telling me this when their kid was potty training. Normally kids want to like, I think boys, I don't know about girls, but boys, they like touch their penis, they like pull it out, they're like, look at this. So when they would put Cheerios in and to have them pee through the Cheerio hole in the toilet, but there was one kid would not touch the genitals. I would be concerned. Wouldn't wipe. That's a potential indication that they maybe had some kind of been sodomized. Total like avoidance of the genitals. So over exploration or under can be indicators. Or if there's been a change. So if a kid normally, a 2-year-old's like, yeah, look what I got, and boys don't have this or whatever. If all of a sudden there's a big shift, that could be an indicator. If you see regression, so that like kids now they're peeing the bed, they weren't before. That can be an indicator of abuse, or it doesn't have to just be sexual, but that can be an indicator that something's going on. And so you can always call that in. Like if kids have been potty trained and then all of a sudden they're not, I'm a little concerned with that. Because that's not normal. I mean, of course, we want to always rule out organic, so we want to encourage them to go to the doctor, but that's not normal. So those would be things where you could have reasonable suspicion. So the sexual assault is for the person who's actually assaulting them. The sexual exploitation is if the parent should have known or did know and didn't do anything. So they don't get off either. That's not okay. Like, oh, well, I didn't do it. Well, but you let Mary take her on special dates, and then she'd come back and tell you different things that she did to her. Like, that's a problem. So willful harm or endangerment, any person causing a child unjustifiable physical pain or mental suffering. So when you get to teenagers, that's their whole life. Unjustifiable mental suffering from their parents, or any caregiver allowing this to happen. So again, we're trying to look at both: is the parent protecting the kid, even if they're not doing the abuse or neglect? Are they protecting the kid? Are they letting that happen? That's a problem if that's the case. And you're also looking at, so like example might be. Let's say you're working with a kid and you know that one of the siblings stuck their finger in their private parts, and they're pretty young, so it's not really normal sex play. Maybe Children Family Service was involved, and then they closed the case, and then all of a sudden they're now having them room together. I got a problem with that. I would probably call in a reasonable suspicion. So it's kind of looking at the different factors. Are you protecting your kid? Or if it's like, I don't know, grandma or grandpa, there's a history of them molesting them and now they're taking it on their own. I have a problem with that. That's not okay because you don't know what's going on when they're away from you. So sleep deprivation, willful harm and endangerment kind of allows for kind of to catch a lot of things. So like sleep deprivation, keeping someone in a cage, like the couple that tied their kids to the beds in Paris, things like that. So neglect is when the person who's the caregiver is not providing adequate clothing, food, shelter, medical care, or supervision. So one thing to think about, but you still would call it in because you don't know. But sometimes when kids are really spastic, like they're very, like maybe they need to be spoon-fed, but they have like a lot of spasticity, like maybe because they have cerebral palsy or something. Sometimes with kids and even adults, they might be severely underweight because it's very hard for them to actually eat. It's not that someone's not giving them food. Like I remember working one time with a woman that had an adult child, and it would literally take 3 hours to feed one meal. And he was significantly underweight. It wasn't because mom wasn't trying to feed him. It was because it was so difficult for him to swallow the food and to eat it. Again, you might look at, do they need to have like a feeding tube? Like if you're having someone that's significantly underweight, obviously that's not sufficient. So then you could call reasonable suspicion saying, I don't know if they're getting appropriate doctor care, because maybe they do need a feeding tube. So you consider those things, because sometimes those are things where people can make judgments and they don't understand the reality of like how difficult that can be. So same with medical care. She talked about it with the kid with diabetes. Are the people caring for them? Are they changing the diet, or do they just not care, or do they not have education and they don't understand? Same with medical care. It could be like if they're sick all the time and no one's actually getting them treated, and it's like now they have like walking pneumonia and they almost died. So those might be things where you might. You always want to get context, but if you're ever, a lot of times there's like a thing in your gut and when you're like, that doesn't sound right. Like even if they say it, you're like, that, there's just something that doesn't sound right with what you're saying. Then you have the option to mandate report. They go out there, they can go further to find out if it's something they need to be worried about. Supervision can be like they have a 2-year-old, they let go out at 2 a.m. I've had a lot of cop friends where they just like find little kids like crawling at like 1 a.m. It can be, maybe it's not supervising enough, and so like another kid's perping on another kid. That could be something where there's not enough supervision, like the parent isn't able to, or the caregiver is not able to give enough supervision to protect the child, or the kid needs more supervision or more care than what, maybe it's over what an average kid is, and the parents aren't providing that, or the caregiver is not providing that. Abuse in out-of-home care, daycare, schools would fall under these areas. The good thing when you call in the hotline is that if it's something that doesn't apply, usually they can tell you or refer it to whoever they need to. I think, is it still sexual and physical the police come out too?
Sexual and physical, severe.
So you evaluate out involves law enforcement.
So this is what can happen. Like, let's say you do let the person know, I have to call this in. Social worker will come out, and then police will come out. And sometimes they're never at the same time. And so then they might call, what the heck, you calling that? Well, no, the police are now coming out because they have to go. Because they have different things they're looking for. Like a kid might get detained, but there might not be legal charges pressed. Because it's a different framework. So usually I like to let people know that if I'm going to let them know, just so they're not like, what the heck, there's now more people. Because it's like if social work comes out, then a cop comes. And they're like, what the heck? You don't have to, but it can be helpful. Mm-hmm.
Sorry, could you repeat that? What cases is it?
Sexual, physical, and severe neglect. So those automatically, the hotline cross reports to law enforcement. So emotion, and sometimes, well, I guess it'd be if you work for CFS, but if you do, like, sometimes people, oh, the cops are already out here. Okay, well, now it's my turn. So emotional abuse, if they're suffering serious emotional damage or at risk of damage, we can report it. This is a permissive report, meaning that we're protected if we report, but do not face penalty for failing to report. So this is where the gray area comes in. That's why I had asked her perspective. I think hers is good, to just be conservative and call in. With emotional abuse, it's more gray. Everything else, if they find that you had information, you're totally liable. Emotional can be a little more gray. I think it's better just to report and try to protect a kid, because you don't know all of the context. Like you might call because the kid said, I don't have shoes and I walk to school, and they go out there and it's like a human trafficking ring, or there's so many things that can happen.
So now we're going to get to the California law with sex. So this is specific to California. So this chart tells you if you need to report or not. So if the kid's under 14 and the other kid's under 14, we're good. But if the kid's under 14, and they're with someone that just turned 14 or turned 15, we have to report. But if they're 16 to 20, and they're with someone, say they're 16, and they're with someone that's 21, we're fine. We don't report it. So a lot of times people are under the assumption that if you're 18, it's automatically, but in California, these are the specific laws. So one of the things that you want to think about, one of the things you want to think about, because this could totally happen, you have someone you're working with and they're 13. And they come in, start of the day and their week, and they have a boyfriend or girlfriend, and they come in and they said, oh my gosh, we had sex this weekend, it was their birthday, they turned 14 or 15, now we have to report it. So, I mean, you have to use caution. If I know they're dating someone that's right on that verge, I might be careful just to let them know these are kind of like when they're doing it too. Because, like, to me, I would be more concerned with a 16-year-old and 21-year-old than a 13 and 14-year-old. But that's the way the laws find out. You oftentimes will have to educate schools. They don't know. And then even when you educate them, they still don't know. And it's like, really? Because I was here last month, and they brought me the actual. So I've had kids where they're 15, and I think the school just doesn't want them to be together because they're disruptive. Oh, you can't be with them because you're 17. And it's like, actually, they totally can. And this is sexual activity. It's not just like they hold hands or go to a movie. It's like sexual activity. Again, that law that I don't know if maybe what holds it, if any kind of oral, anal, that is all reportable, whether it's consensual or not, whether there's an age difference or not. So that's where I would encourage kids to not go into the details. You can let them know, I'm good, I'm fine with talking about sex, but if you go into specifics, you might have to report that. So this is a chart to keep handy so that you know, because a lot of times people don't know. They're not concerned about, 13 and 15, but they're calling because they're, 14-year-olds with the 20-year-olds. And that's, if you're doing that, I guess you could still say it's reasonable suspicion, but there's a law specifically, so you're breaking confidentiality for something that's really not important. So, if you're like, my perspective is this doesn't make any sense to me, but it's what the California law is, and so you just keep informed with that. And then, of course, you go to different states, different laws. It's not just like an umbrella everywhere. And so that's one thing to keep in mind if you start working out of state, is there's different ethics, different laws, different ways it's interpreted.
So we talked about this a little bit in our other classes, that since this is more legal and ethical, you have knowledge. I just get confused with the statutory rape law. Does that pretty much get canceled out by this? Because my understanding is that as long as one person is over the age of 18, the other one's under, it's considered statutory rape. But does this cancel it?
I'm not sure. This is for our reporting requirements.
Okay.
So I don't know. I don't know if it actually, but in terms of for our requirements, this is what the California law indicates. I'm assuming that works, like, because I've had, so like my boss had a past youth that got in trouble, and knowing the California law, I'm like, whatever they're saying was not true. Because it's always like, oh, we're just a few months apart. Like a few months and several years. That's what it was. I forgot that part. It didn't make sense, but I'm not sure with that. You have to. I can look it up and see.
So okay, this is basically saying that this is what we have to report, but it's not necessarily saying like legal issues, more so just like reporting.
Well, it's the California law that we follow. So I don't know. I'll look it up and see. but that's what the California law is now. And usually, like, counties will give like breakdown charts like that, so you kind of have an idea. Yeah. So I'll look it up. I'll find out if because I'm not sure how that works. I just know what the consensual. Obviously, if it's not consensual sexual activity, that's a totally different ballpark. So let me look it up and I can let you know. So other abuse. So this is where sexting is like tricky. Yeah. So we need to report any suspicion of someone knowingly downloading, streaming, or accessing images or videos that involve a minor engaging in sexual acts or a naked minor. So what happens when your client that's 12 sends a picture of their boobs or penis or whatever to their friend? That's child porn. It's them, but it's child porn. And you're transmitting it. So I think it's important to educate kids if you're working with them because they don't think that. Because that's like popular, right? Everyone's like, you don't know my name, but here's one of my nipples. And they're like, oh, okay. So when abuse occurs out of state, we report the abuse to our local child welfare agency. So if you...
Or does it apply when it's like, well, my friend said like her grandma posted like a naked baby picture of her brother. Does that like count?
I mean, probably technically. I don't imagine that happens much. But maybe there's more to it. Like, you're like, well, the baby had a ball gag on. You're like, well, you forgot that piece. That was a lot. So, yeah, I mean, especially with kids, like teens, even if they're not reporting that, I talk to them about that. Because I don't want them to have to do that. And then if, like, I did have a youth that was getting naked pictures from a person I don't think was actually a minor, but was portraying that they were. So then we had to call in, and then the police had to come out, and it was pretty awkward time. Like, we had to read it together. Like, how did it come about? I don't know. And like, well, because it said in there, you want to see something hot. So were you talking about, like, slow-cooked meals, or, like, I'm not sure. So, yeah. But just help kids know that, because or if they're, like, sending each other pictures that they got from other kids. That's all child porn. And they'll get in trouble. Well, I just sent it because my friend sent it to me. You're streaming, transmitting child porn. That's a problem. So if out-of-state abuse, call your local child welfare agency. So if you're working with someone, they're like, hey, such and such happened when I lived in Tennessee. Call your local child welfare agency, give them whatever information you have, and they'll take it from there. If a victim died, we still want to report the abuse allegations. Probably for sure would if someone died. Like, oh, my sister died when they beat him. You're going to be like, oh, well, they're not alive anymore, so no more danger. Mm-hmm.
I'm kind of curious, why would you report the abuse to the different states that it could?
I don't know the rationale. I just know what the rule is. That you just go, maybe because it complicates things. Like, someone then has to find, what state, and what's the county. I don't know counties outside of, I barely know California counties. So maybe that's why. I just know that's what I was taught, so I just am like, do you know if there's any?
When you report child abuse, you need to know the jurisdiction. So law enforcement can't investigate something in San Bernardino that happened in LA. So you just have to know the jurisdiction.
You can't report it to both counties.
Well, no, you only report it to the county where it happened because you don't have jurisdiction.
Well, if it's out of state, it's in like.
Out of state, you would still report it. Mm-hmm. If you know the state, like you said, you were abused in Texas and whatever county, then I would just call that hotline if you were still a minor and report what happened. Mm-hmm.
So that, from what I understand, you just call your local and then they can move it to whatever county. But
yeah. County will call in a whole referral.
So, and then if the abuser has moved away or is no longer in touch with the children, so if they moved away, because what you have to think about is do they have access to children, and that's pretty easy. So basically, the best thing is just if you have reasonable suspicion, call it in. If you have a part of information, call it in still, because maybe someone else called in the other piece that you're missing. Just if when in doubt, call it in. Remember that if you have a boss that tells you not to, it's still your requirement. So if something happens, you can't use well, my boss told me no. You might see that more, like I see that more in facilities, where they're like, oh, we don't want people out here. It's like, well, this is still a mandated report, whether or not you want people out here or not. So protect yourself, and you're protecting children, because you want to try to help or have eyes on a child. Especially be really cautious with kids under 5, because nobody sees them. So if you have any kind of reasonable suspicion, because they don't go to school, probably, they might go to preschool, they're pretty vulnerable, pretty needy, and they're not seen much. So always consider, regardless of age, but especially when you're working with kids under 5. So some special topics. If a client is 18 or older and reports abuse occurred when they were a minor, the therapist would maintain confidentiality unless there is a reasonable suspicion that the perpetrator was abusing other minors. So my personal thing is I think it's very easy to have reasonable suspicion because they still have access to other kids. So technically, if they're over 18, but I would want to know, are they still alive? Yes. Are there children anywhere near there? Probably. So personally, if it's an adult reporting past abuse, there's a high likelihood that whoever has access to kids, and I would just call it in. But technically, you can maintain confidentiality and be okay legally. A child taken out of state without permission would constitute kidnapping and not abuse or neglect. So when we look at children and adults have abduction, children don't. The therapist would maintain confidentiality and encourage the client to contact law enforcement. Downloading, well, we already went over that. Any kind of downloading, possessing, or transmitting child pornography is sexual exploitation. So you're not actually doing anything, but you're participating in some child being harmed. Standard of care requires that therapists assess for child abuse and neglect when any risk factors are present. So do you guys know any risk factors? Or any things that might be indicators? Because I think it's important to know that stuff. It's easy to just tell people, well, the standard of care says blah, 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 blah. What do you think are signs of abuse or neglect? Mm-hmm.
So they're not bathing, with the same clothes like a couple days in a row.
Mm-hmm.
Teeth, brushed, you see like stuff kind of building up
Mm-hmm. Poor development. If you have a baby that should be raising their head, rolling over, and they're like not, that would potentially be an indicator that something's going on.
speaking problems as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
If you have a child that is very timid around their parent, and your parent maybe talks more aggressively, or I don't know, like you can just sense the child's afraid without reason.
Yeah.
Possibly look into it further.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Kids, what about just bruises?
It depends where.
Yeah. So if it's age appropriate, because they're learning to walk or something, and it's like a bruise where you would fall. But if it's like inner thigh and it's a finger, how'd you fall on that? Like, what's going on there? Or like she said, the gouge marks. Or if it doesn't match. So the bruise, because do you guys know kind of how bruises progress? Like they change colors. They're kind of like a mood ring, but with your capillaries. So initially they're dark purple, and then as they get older, they turn like green, yellow. So if someone comes in and I'm like, oh, well, looks like you got hurt, and it's like, yeah, they fell yesterday, and it's yellow, I'm gonna be like, that doesn't make any sense. Like, unless you went back in time. And with Endgame, maybe they did. What? I never watched any of them, so I was so lost the whole time. People were screaming, and I'm like, who are these other people? What about, like, what are some other things that you might be indicators that you might be concerned if a kid starts doing?
What about their like behavior change? Like maybe they're outgoing and then they start isolating.
Yeah, potentially. Mm-hmm.
So sometimes they'll like just have weird outbursts, like on simple stuff, like you go and hand them something and they like freak out like you're gonna kill them or something.
Yeah. So, and you can always get information, but again, if you just have reasonable suspicion, that's sufficient. Because kids can have off days or whatever. Maybe if they're overly starving all the time. I mean, you have to be careful once you're a teenager because they're all like, I didn't eat, and you're like, you ate like 8 pounds of beef, or tofu or whatever.
Like behavior that's like not age appropriate.
Yeah. Over sexualized. So with people that have been sexually abused, they can become hypersexual, so very fixated on sex, but also over sexualized. I remember working with quite a few people that were now adults with sexual abuse, and so if you ever work with someone, this might happen, and so it's really important to clarify this situation. So I've heard from multiple people, well, at some point I was seducing them. So they're like overly sexualized 12-year-olds. And it's trying to remind them that these are like 30-year-old men or women. Like there's never an okay reason. Even if you're like, milkshake comes on, all in their, like that is just never okay. Because people will do that, they'll feel guilty. Like, oh, well, it was my fault. No. Because you're a kid and they're an adult. That's like not okay. Other things that I've seen, especially if someone's had chronic sexual abuse, is that sometimes that is the only way that they have formed relationships. And so at some point they might seek that out. It still does not mean that they're not a victim. It's that maybe that's the only time they actually got acknowledged or touched. Because it gets twisted in someone that's been a victim. They think, oh, well, that means that I was whatever. Or if they have any kind of pleasure, your body is made to respond. So if you have pleasure, that still doesn't make it not sexual abuse. Mm-hmm.
I was also going to say that sometimes the language, sometimes you just look at it, you hear them out, and you just go past it. For example, I've heard a case where a little girl was talking to their teacher or something, and like little conversations, and Daddy ate my cookie, which was, sexual related.
Yeah.
And they did not even realize that it was.
Or they're listening to Good Form by Nicki Minaj. That too. Yeah, if they're saying things that don't make sense, and finding out what those words mean. Because, like, have you, like, I don't know if you guys ever watched someone interview someone that is just, like, should never work with kids. So they're like, has anyone ever touched your genitals? And they're like, I don't know what that is. So no, absolutely not. Like, finding out, like, what they call it. And being comfortable saying words that maybe you don't normally say. Like, I remember when we were doing induction, we had to spend, like, a whole day coming up with all of the words for vaginas and boobs. And initially people were like, it's like, no, you gotta get into it. Like, jugs, you're, like, going through. You're, like, making stuff up. One thing that could be, too, is if a kid knows things they shouldn't. So, like, the challenge, too, is you have to think of also... I mean, it doesn't make it okay, but, like, if someone, let's say a family is very poor and has to live in, like, one room, the kid might be somewhat exposed to things that normally they wouldn't because of the living circumstances. But if they're saying things that like I've had kids that come in where like the grown men are like blushing about like when they get mad they tell them things. Like a 10-year-old saying like, "You cocksucker, your mom must have came in your mouth and you spit it back out, you snowballed, you fucking bit." Like it's like, what? Like where did that even come from? So things where it's like that's not appropriate. Or even if they're like, let's say the parent lets them watch porn. I'm not okay with that. Like if because I've seen parents, that's fine. They're 10. Like I don't think so. Well, we're comfortable. Okay, but that's not appropriate. Like they don't need to be looking at that. So you want to kind of be able to ask things and be comfortable, especially as a social worker. Like, I know in a class that I taught in the past, I was surprised they didn't complain about me because sometimes I accidentally say bad words, but there was a guest lecturer that said like the F word twice, and at the end of the evaluations they were like, "Oh, I was so offended." I can like agree with that, but you're not gonna make it as a social worker because you're gonna hear all that just from like a coworker. That's not even counting like the people you're gonna work with. So you need to get comfortable hearing things and not having a reaction, because if you do, it might make the person stop talking because they're like, "Ooh, you don't like that," or they'll know how to mess with you. You all have someone that knows how to mess with you, and as soon as they see reactions, they just keep going there. You're like, "Can we talk about like sandwiches instead of this? Because you just keep talking about this." So learn to be comfortable. It doesn't mean you need to use it or agree with using different words, but be comfortable with the fact that different people have different language, you know? And sometimes, I mean, there's been some people where I will use something that's not like horrible, but just to build that relationship, because they feel like I'm like this like tight, like, social worker. You don't need to do that, but I've had that where I'll, say fuck or something. Just to kind of like make them realize like I'm a person and I'm here to help you.
So for the scenario you were given about the parent letting their kids watch porn and their grades, what can you do about that? Is just
Call report.
Okay, that's all you can do?
No, you can call report. I don't think, personally, I would not be okay with that. Yeah. I don't. General neglect? Yeah, that wouldn't be. Don't because the hard thing, it's hard, especially if you don't have kids, because you don't really know what's like normal and not normal. But even if you do have kids, the versions of normal, not normal vary drastically depending on culture, region, all kinds of things. And sometimes when you talk to people, they can be really convincing. But if you have this feeling where you're like, that doesn't sound right, just call it in. The worst case, they'll rule it out. They won't even come out.
Do we have to have like a general category when we call it the
No, you just bring it the information.
Oh.
Like the one with one of the kids got a naked penis through their Facebook, I think. And from what I understood, that was a minor. So when I called it in, I'm like, I don't even know. I just know that technically this is child pornography. So I didn't even know if it was. They did end up coming out. But that's kind of newer. So even they were like, I don't know if that's my supervisor. Because it's like this person saying they're 14. If they are, they've had a really rough life. Because that is not what a 14-year-old looks like. But let's just go with that. And so then, the cops came out and we got to read the steamy messages where they were just shocked that a penis came through their inbox. Really? So if you're not working in a professional capacity, filing in a child abuse report is optional. So she touched on that. It sounds like she does call neighbors, like when she lived in an apartment. It's really you're you. And that would be that's ethical, not necessarily, because your legal mandates are off once you're not working. I remember one time I worked at a clinic, and there's this big brick building, like brick wall, And I came out with the county car, and across this house, they were beating this kid. You could hear that, like, and I was like, oh, so I called in, I'm like, I don't know which house it is, but we're over here, and they were, like, beating the crap out of this kid. I don't know what ended up happening, because I couldn't really give them a house number. I'm like, just follow the punches, you'll find it. Yeah, I was like, I know the street, but I don't know which house. I'm like, just go to each house and check for bruises. So, yeah. In terms of informing the client, you need to file a report, and processing their reactions is not legally required, but the BBS, the Board of Behavioral Science, considers it best practice unless doing that would put the client, victim, or therapist in danger. So you consider that. So examples where I would is like, if a kid's working with me and they start to, for the first time, disclose maybe some sexual abuse or physical abuse, if I call in, they're going to know who told, because they haven't told anyone else. So I might tell them, hey, so just so you know, remember when we talked about in the beginning about limits confidentiality, this is something that I do need to report. And then you can, like, things I've done even with families, if I felt it was safe, is I'd say, do you want me to call while you're here so you hear what I tell them? And then I'll do that with them. I've not had any bad reactions. Usually people are like, okay, and I explain, this is what I need to do. And if they're a little upset, I'm like, I understand, but this is my mandate, and this is what we talked about in the beginning. I've not had anyone, like, threaten to hurt me or anything like that. But I imagine that does happen. So you need to always consider that. And then you also have to consider safety. If it's something that's urgent, like a kid comes in, they've got, like, bruising everywhere, and they're saying when they get home, they're not, like, I'm not going to call the parent and be like, so I'm going to call the hotline and I'm not going to let them go home. So it's up to you. That's more of an ethical component of confidentiality. So failure to provide medical care is neglect and would constitute a report. So you might not know a lot about medical stuff. So if you just have a concern and it looks like it's not being done, then you need to just call it in, because they have public health nurses that can come out, and you want to have other eyes on the kid. You don't need to figure, like I was saying with the kids that are more spastic, they might be quite a bit underweight because of the spasticity. It's not because they're being neglected, but you don't know that, and so you need to just call in because you have suspicion. Failure to provide shelter, so homelessness, does not on its own constitute neglect. So we're not going to call in because you don't have a home. That's like penalizing you for hitting hard times. If they don't have access to things, then you might. So they're like, I don't have running water, electricity, and we are 50 miles from the nearest house. That would be concerning. But just because they're homeless doesn't mean that. And a lot of times, people's homelessness means it's just like couch surf. You might have something like, maybe if the weather is extremely severe and they have no plan for, like, a cold shelter or a warm shelter, that might be something, because it's like they're like, oh, we're just going to be out there, and it's like, but it's like the Arctic chill, like, the Arctic chill that came through the Midwest. I'd be a little bit more concerned about that. Or if the child has some kind of medical issue that makes them more sensitive, you might consider that as well. Or like oxygen, you have to have electricity. You actually get a huge electricity bill if you're on oxygen, unless you have the mobile tanks, but usually they have the machine. So that's going to be an issue if a kid requires that, and they're like, we don't have electricity because we couldn't afford it. Well, you can't meet their medical needs then. So lewd and lascivious behaviors between minors ages 14 or 15 with a partner who is 10 or more years older is a mandated report. So if they're 14 and they're dating a 24-year-old, mandated report. If they're 14 and they're dating a 20-year-old, you don't report, based on California law. But if they're 13 and 15, someone's going to jail. That is something, like the boys that I work with, because it is not uncommon for them to do sexual things with each other. When I do their education, which they all hate, Like, don't bring the bananas and the condoms out. I will talk to them about, you might think it feels good, but it's not going to feel good locked up. So yeah, this is like, because it'll happen. I mean, kids, they want to feel good, someone's offering, but if there's that age differential, like, I kind of pound that into their head. And so I would encourage you for that if they live in a facility kind of setup. Because they're like, well, I just wanted to feel good. Like, I've had plenty of kids that I don't even necessarily think that they're gay, or they're just kind of like opportunities arise kind of thing. So really encourage that if you have a kid that's living in a setting where there's a lot of other boys, or maybe has a roommate or whatever, because they can ruin their life if they get those charges. Hard thing is when you're a kid, you don't really think. So you tell them all that, and then the opportunity arises, and they're like, you know what, live for today. And then you're like, okay, see you in jail. So family law. So first we'll go over marriage and domestic partnership. Then we'll go over how it all ends. And then talk a little bit about custody, and as well as conservatorship. So marriage in California. Oh, sorry, I'll go through. So family law just focuses on the responsibilities of family members in different roles, from the time they're born to the time they die. So that's what family law looks at. Family law is not necessarily child welfare. That you see that a lot where people are, maybe they're trying to get custody or arrange custody. They're like, CPS is involved. There might not be. You do get a lot of calls in CPS when they're trying to frame each other for everything, because they don't really care that their kid has to be asked all these questions. They just really want to get that person back for, like, forgetting the anniversary or not fixing all the issues that their mom or dad left, you know. So you do see that a lot, where it's like consistent, and you're like, oh my gosh, you have a family law court pending. And they tell the kid, tell them they did this, and they did this, and you're like, you're a horrible person. But you don't say that, you just say it with your eyes. You get really good at that as a social worker. So in California, marriage is a contract with another person for respect, fidelity, and support. So I don't think we knew that, respect and fidelity. I'm like, uh-oh. Support is emotional, but it also is assets. So where's the money at? Assets each individual has prior to marriage are considered separate property. Same with debt. Once you're married, all the assets acquired are considered community property. So if you get divorced, then that has to be settled. We do talk in a couple slides down, I think, where it talks about prenups, or the next one. Sometimes it's a little tricky to identify what was separate property prior to marriage, and so that's when people get prenuptial agreements, so that it can clearly in writing say, this is separate property. This is not community property. So if we don't work out, you don't get your hands on this. Yeah, and so then if that's the case, and I think it depends on the years of marriage as well, there's certain things that you're entitled to. Retirement, if they acquire retirement through there, then you could get half of that. So in terms of communication between spouses, it's privileged under the law. So if that's why, I don't know if you guys ever watch like law shows, or they're like, I'm asserting privilege or something like that. Usually it's like in the wrong context. You're like, I don't even know what you're talking about. So spouses don't testify against spouses in legal proceedings. You can, though, so maybe you didn't know this. I didn't until last night. You can sue your spouse if they injure you for damages. So yeah, you sign a prenup, but I'm suing you for damages, so I'm going to get all that. California has no criteria or recognition of common law marriages. So different states have different rules. So in certain states, if you're together and acting as if you're married for a certain amount of time, you're considered a common law married. California does not have that clearly. And so then that becomes an issue if someone moves from a different state where they were considered common law. They come to California, things end, then the judge has to decide based on the law. and previous decisions that were made. And what you'll see sometimes with people is they won't get married, and it's not because they just, a lot of times it's for necessity. So like with people that have Social Security, it's different when you're married. So the people that have been together for like 20 years, and they're never going to get married because that will reduce their income. Or it can change what they're eligible for because they consider the spouse's income as well. Like when I worked for APS, I saw a lot of people who have been divorced for a long time but were taking care of each other. And that's when I started realizing, oh, you aren't just friendly exes. Some were, but a lot of times it was that sometimes being married can really limit what you have access to. So like with in-home support services, if you have an able and available spouse, certain things they will not pay them because they consider that what a spouse should be doing. So like cooking you food, cleaning, laundry, errands, there's an expectation. Well, the challenge is when the spouse can't work now, like, then I think that goes above and beyond. But there is stipulations that happen because of marriage. So California has domestic partnership, and it's one of the few states that continue to maintain it, even though same-sex marriage was legalized. So domestic partnership still exists in California. You can also get married, but it is something that they continued that provision. Domestic partnership, for California, the statute defines it as two adults who have chosen to share one another's lives in an intimate and committed relationship of mutual caring. So I'm going to call my best friend and be like, we're domestic partners, because we pretty much do that. And then you have, it is not the same as marriage. So sometimes that was kind of like the argument, like, you have domestic partnership. There are certain things that it did not protect. And then the challenge outside of state lines is that the other states didn't have to recognize any of that. So I've known of clients where they go out to ski in Utah, and the person gets really hurt, and they won't let them back there, and their partner dies alone. Because they're like, we don't recognize domestic partnership. It has to be immediate family. That's kind of a problem. So that sometimes you hear that we're like, it's exactly the same. There are a lot of similarities, but there's also differences with domestic partnership as opposed to marriage. So, ending a marriage, so everything that begins ends. Sometimes death, sometimes divorce. So California does not require the spouse to show that the other spouse did something wrong in order to end their marriage. So I guess in other states you have to like really prove your case. It can't just be like, they're going to die if they stay with me kind of thing. Like you have to like prove that they weren't the right spouse. When one spouse files for disillusionment of the marriage, the other spouse is served paperwork. After 6 months, the divorce can be final, unless it gets contested. So that's when people start going back and forth. You know, like, you never cared for me then, I'm going to take you for all you got, or vice versa. If it does get contested, it can go for years trying to finalize a divorce. Legal separation can occur without a divorce. The spouses, you can't marry other people, so this is helpful for people who maybe don't believe in divorce. Or maybe just don't want to go through all that. Domestic partnership ends similar to divorce. One partner files a notice of domestic partnership to end the legal contract. So similar setup for family law. So now we get to custody. So this will help us a little bit with kind of expanding more on how we navigate when there's custody issues, like who consents. That's important to know. So we can be custody evaluators, but if the court puts us in that position, so we work for family law court, our ethic codes are different. So it's a little tricky. Doesn't mean you can't do it, but the ethics codes are different when you're working in that capacity. Yeah, so there's 4 categories of custody. And this would be once someone is divorcing. So sole custody, one parent has full authority to make decisions for the child. So if you have someone come in and they're saying that they're divorced and the other parent has sole custody, you can't do anything unless that parent consents. It doesn't matter if the other parent does, because they don't have the legal rights to make those decisions. Primary custody is where a child is with one parent most of the time. That might be like the 75-25. They're with, this parent on the weekends, this parent during the week. Generally, in these arrangements, the parent who has a child at the moment has the ability to consent. So that's why it's helpful, and it talks about that at the end of the slide, to get a custody agreement, because there's all kinds of exceptions and ways that they can rule that maybe are out of, you can't just assume like if it's primary custody then that means either one can, because there might be a stipulation saying only this person can, or they have to have 50-50 or something like that. Joint custody is where both parents have legal authority to make decisions. So they're both able to, so then you would need both parents to consent to treat. So if one's like, yeah, the other one's like, it's their fault that the kid's like this. You can't. You have to have both parents to consent. Split custody is where there's multiple kids and parents have main custody over certain kids. So like brothers with mom, sisters with dad most of the time. Then with split custody, and they don't do this a lot because it's trickier, the parent that they're with most of the time generally has a decision-making power. So we want to make sure that we don't make assumptions based on custody, that we want to get the specifics of their custody agreement. Obviously, so let's say someone comes in, and again, it's good faith, so we don't need to be like Angela Lansbury, like we're like investigating or something. If a parent comes in and they're like, I'm not divorced and I can make this decision, then you document that. And then if the other parent comes in and they're like, what the heck? I have sole custody, I have all these things, good faith. This is what they said. Because you might see that with like the caregiver, like aunt or family friend comes in, oh, I've been raising this kid for 15 years, the mom's not around, dad's not around, they died in a fire accident, and then like a couple of days later, here comes magically the parent looking quite good for dying in a fire accident. I did not consent. Well, they signed an affidavit, I was just going on good faith. So you don't need to go into like deep investigation, you just go up, but you document that, what they said. Parent reported they have full legal decision making, or reported that spouse is dead, and then they magically come back alive, and you're like, what a miracle. Because that does happen a lot. Mm-hmm.
So what exactly are the roles of the clinical social worker acting as a custody evaluator? Then are they just approving whether or not like?
I don't know a lot about that, so I don't want to like say stuff that I don't know. The little bit that I do know, which could be completely wrong, is they evaluate kind of who the family system, and I think that's where they evaluate make recommendations for the court.
Okay, on who should get what type of custody, or just who should get custody?
Possibly, but I don't know enough. I don't want to say that. That's what I'm thinking, but I can look into it to figure out. I think that's generally what they do, but they follow different ethics, and so it gets a little tricky if you're a social worker, and you work that job, because you're opposing your own ethics in some ways. Not saying you can't. I'm sure there's a ton of LCSWs that are court evaluators. Bless them, because I can't. Family law court is like, when we do psychodynamics, she'll be like, this makes sense, family law court. This had nothing to do with the children all along.
I was just curious, because on any of the federally recognized Indian reservations, it's sovereign land technically, so they have their own tribal court that does everything, but even, so I met with a client that was trying to get custody, and so I was able to make those recommendations. I didn't have to do any investigation or anything, but the tribal court itself still did its own investigation to see where the other biological parent at, because this was someone related to the child in question, but they weren't they were a biological relative, not the parent, because the parent had died. So they don't know where the other parent was, so the court itself still investigated to see where is this parent. They were trying to validate later story.
Because sometimes people, it's really funny how people are like, they died, and then they just like appear. Really, because I think I saw them at Walmart. I remember having people say, I worked in this little town, and everyone went to this liquor store across from where I worked, and I would go get Diet Coke every day. And I don't know how many times like my caregiver died, and I'm like, oh my gosh, they handed me my Diet Coke. They are alive. Who knew? So guardianship and adoption. So guardianship is when someone other than the parent is appointed to care for the child. So there's guardianship supervised by the juvenile court, so that's child welfare, and there's guardianship supervised by probate court. Guardianship by the juvenile court would be where a kid is involved with the juvenile family system and has had abuse or neglect, and the parent never reunified or was unable to or passed away, and now we're looking at, let's make a long-term plan for this youth. Is maybe they've been with this foster parent for 10 years or 2 years or a family member, and so they move to try to have guardianship because it's more permanency. There's now a legal thing saying, I'm willing to take on this kid. And so guardianship might happen. You see it like probably more with like older kids or like kids that have been in the system for a while, like maybe mom and dad kind of like tried for a little bit and then bounced out, tried for a little bit and bounced out. They might not want to be adopted, but the person is willing to do guardianship. And then for the probate court, it's when a child is living with a parent, an adult is not the parent, and provides them the ability to make medical decisions. So an example would be, let's say you are in the military and you have a 4-year-old. Mm-hmm.
Can you repeat what probate is?
Probate court is probate guardianship. Guardianship supervised by the probate court is when a child is living with an adult that's not the parent. And it gives the person that's not the parent ability to make medical decisions. So to consent for mental health, for instance. So the parent is just not available. So if you're in the military, you have a 5-year-old, you get deployed, and you're like, I don't really want to bring them to wherever they're deploying you. Maybe you have a friend or a family member that you're like, can you keep them? I'm going to be gone for 3 years. Obviously, we need to be able to make medical decisions that don't require getting in touch with someone that might be like deep in a forest or something like that. So they can make those probate guardianships related to that. I think the book didn't talk about that, but probate courts also usually do things when people are deceased. So I imagine that could be part of probate guardianship as well. So like if parent dies, but they're not involved in child welfare, I don't know that for sure, so I don't want to say that, but I know I've had a lot of youth that the parent just died. It wasn't any issue with like child welfare, and so then they name a family friend or parent's best friend as guardian, and it just provides legally more support, and then it also provides some hope for permanence for the kid as well, because someone's taking that extra step. Adoption is when another adult becomes responsible for a child. So there's 2 kinds of adoption. There's open adoption and there's closed adoption. Open adoption is where you know who the parents are. Maybe you still see them. Closed adoption is where you have no idea. And then there's sometimes stuff in between. So like my little brother was adopted, and the way that the biological mom told my parents is here is a letter I wrote to him if he ever wants it after he turns 18. He's never taken it, but like it was a little bit in between because it wasn't like you can never know. And so that's where we see some challenges with changes in the focuses of rights, because adoption kind of goes back and forth, but there's a time where it's like you have no contact, you have no idea, but now with shifts in rights, they do have a right to know that. And so that can create problems with like current policies and procedures if those kind of bump heads. Mm-hmm.
What is the
If they adopt them?
Like, with their disease,
Well, so you don't have to, if you're raising a kid, you don't necessarily have to have guardianship or any of those things. That's why they have like the caregiver affidavit if someone's consenting for a youth to get mental health services, because mom and dad, no one's seen them for 10 years. So you can just have the kid and you've raised them basically. I mean, that's not uncommon. If you want it to be like legally solid, then you can do like guardianship or adoption. If it's eligible. So that's the thing too, is like sometimes people can't be adopted or the kid doesn't want it. You're not going to force someone. But that's pretty common. Family members raising other people's kids. It's pretty common. So again, in terms of for us as social workers, what we're going to look at is there any legal pieces, any legal orders put into place? If not, and they're coming in for mental health care, then we need to make sure we get a caregiver affidavit and that we have that on file for that youth. Because we don't want to postpone their ability to get services, because maybe the parent's dead. I mean, sometimes I've worked with kids, they're like, I don't know where they are. They just kind of disappeared. Mm-hmm.
The caregiver affidavits too, would you just have to get one copy done, and then you just give copies to new care providers every time you go somewhere new? Like as the parent, or like the guardian?
The guardian?
Yeah.
Usually the agencies have a caregiver affidavit, and so you just sign theirs. And then if you're lying and like the parent comes in, they're like, oh, my stupid brother, he always thinks they need help and they don't. You had good faith and you're protected then. They might be in trouble, but you're okay because based on the information that you had, you made that decision. Because sometimes when that happens, parents come in like ready. The people just love shame and punishment. Like, you're just like, oh my gosh, just watch a show or something. And they're just like, you did this. And it's like, no, like it's personal. One thing I like to tell clients when they're like, you ruined my life, I tell them, you know what, I've been ruining mine, it's full time. I just don't know if I have time to ruin anyone else's. So for conservatorship, so we'll go a little bit more into it, so I'm just going to kind of briefly go over, and then what I wanted to do is go over some general like scenarios, and then I'll help you guys to connect like the legal and ethical piece to those to kind of be a primer for your midterm. So conservatorship is when an elder or dependent adult, so you guys know what a dependent adult is? How would you define dependent adult?
Someone over 18 who may not be able to take care of themselves. Like, if they can't make decisions, they can't care, can't provide, proper basic needs.
Maybe an ability to do their ADLs by themselves.
So they can't do basic changing their clothes, eating, even like things like make their food. Maybe they're pretty independent, but they really need help with that. Do you have any other? So, and it's up to 64. So in California, anyone that's in California that's 65 or older is considered an elder. So dependent adult is pretty broad. A lot of times the people in the populations that we work with, if we work with adults, they do need help. But you're like, is that a dependent adult? I don't really know. So again, if you have reasonable suspicion, you just call it in. Like maybe you have someone that has pretty significant mental health issues, generally pretty functional, but you're like, I don't know if they would fall under that. So if someone's an elder, dependent adult, they can't care for themselves or make sound decisions, the courts can legally scale back their rights. Conservatorships are really hard. I've worked on one, and I literally had to write like 60 pages of notes, and they barely conservatorized them. I mean, this person was like telling me, like, where'd you sleep last night? Under a car. Well, what if you got hit? I'm invisible. Okay, that works well. Now every time I go out to drive my car, I like check, like, anybody under there? Just like totally like if he didn't show up, I would like go through alleys because I figured he was dead. Like he was just so, and it was very hard. So it's not an easy thing because you're basically taking someone's rights away. So the courts are not like easy. They're not like, oh yeah, let's do that. You have to have a lot of documentation. So we have two kinds of California. We have probate conservatorship and LPS conservatorship. Who do you guys know who's famous that was conservatorship? Yeah. What?
Actually, I've seen
Well, so hers would be probate conservatorship. Because LPS is very specific and that's the one that's hard. Obviously, if you have money, things are easier. So, like I'm kind of confused how for that many years she had a conservator, and my client who sleeps under car seat is invisible. It was like a pretty brutal fight to get help for them. So probate conservatorship is when the conservator is responsible for the conservatory, their living arrangement, their health care, general well-being. One thing that happens a lot is people confuse power of attorney with conservatorship, not the same thing. And you'll see that all the time, especially the person that knows they did something they shouldn't have. Well, I'm conservator. Show me the paperwork. We don't have any. I don't think you know what I'm talking about, because you would totally have some paperwork. Or they give you a power of attorney, and you're like, okay, let's slow it down. So it can be general well-being as well. There's also, which is not conservatorship, is payee. Because you'll hear, like, if you're not familiar with those things, if you end up working like with older adults or dependent adults, people will come in and throw all these terms at you, hoping that you like back down. So payee is if like they're getting Social Security, they can't manage their money, so they get maybe they have like mania. So they'll have periods where they'll get their $900 and decide I'm going to buy $900 worth of Chex Mix, and I don't know how I'm going to survive the rest of the month. One thing to think about is when you're doing clinical assessments, if someone has a payee, that would help to justify medical necessity. So add that in there. If they have a payee for the Social Security, that is showing that their symptoms are creating significant dysfunction to where they need someone else to manage their money. So payee, basically, it can really be anyone, which is the problem. And what they're supposed to do is manage, like if they have a place to rent, then that payee pays the rent, and then they take whatever's left and give them each week a little bit. So like he probably doesn't need one, but I have a kid with me that's a non-minor dependent, and so he gets like a chunk. So they have him on payee, so he gets, his rent's amazing. I wish I had that rent. Can I pay that much? But he has like, I don't know, $600 after, so every week I give him like $150. And that way, if he decides to go crazy at Target or buy like $200 shoes, he's not like screwed then for the rest of the month, because that's what happens. Like I would work with clients who didn't have payees that first of the month, don't hear from them. Second or third day, I'm out of money. Why? Well, I stayed at the Hyatt for the first 3 days. Okay. I have nowhere to stay now. That's showing that you're not able to manage your money. So if you work with people who are showing that they already have Social Security, really try to advocate for them to get a payee, because sometimes that can really make a difference for them. The downside is they can just find someone on the street, be my payee, and I'll give you $20, and they just give them all their money. So you can't really control that. But it's not conservatorship. So power of attorney, payee, those are things thrown out, and they'll say I'm conservator, and you're like, no, you're not. So other things can be financial. So I'm pretty sure with Britney Spears it was just financial. Her dad was managing all of her finances. Actually, I think it was her healthcare too. So it's specific. It can be one or the other or both. And the conservatorship will clearly outline it. One thing, so in practice I don't see this, but according to what I've read, you still have the conservatory consent. Even if you have the conservator and the conservatory. In practice I've not seen that. Usually if someone has a conservator, they're not the one consenting. But from what I've read in legal and ethical texts, you would. For probate conservatorship, family members can say, hey, I need to put this into the courts. LPS conservatorship is different. This is less common. This is where your rights are just taken away. So people, I know before Reagan and deinstitutionalization, a lot of our consumers that were diagnosed with severe mental illness resided in institutions. Some of the things that led to that change, because people will say that sometimes, like, oh, we just take horrible care of our homeless and our mentally ill. Some of the things that changed is prior to like 50s, 60s, there was no medicine. So there was no way to like have someone be able to manage their symptoms other than lobotomies and ECT. And they still do ECT now. Loma Linda does it all the time. It's very effective treatment for depression. That's where they shock you. They do put you under so you don't lose teeth and all that stuff. But if you have treatment-resistant depression, it's a very helpful intervention. But back in the day, they didn't have anything other than poke you in your eye and kind of scramble your brain, or lobotomy, or I'm going to electrocute you. And usually they were awake, so I'm sure those were super fun. Kind of like those cartoons where the person breaks in their teeth, kind of I'm sure that's kind of what it looked like in real life. Like, oh, there it is. So prior to that, there was not really options, and so people were kept in institutions because what are you going to do? Like, you can't manage symptoms. With the introduction of medication, that changed things. And then with the introduction of mental illness being added to what can be considered Social Security, like a disability, then you have people that now could potentially function out there because they have a source of income. Because that's the other problem is, let's say you let them out, they can't function in an occupational capacity. And then with the civil rights movement, that created a shift all around. People started looking at people that are diagnosed with mental health issues. They do have rights too. They're not like not human. And when you read about some of the treatments, they treated them like they weren't human, like lock them to walls. Some institutions would pour alcohol and light them on fire. That was like a normal treatment. Do all kinds of weird things that you can do today. So for LPS, the government agency actually submits that. So usually with LPS conservatorship, from what I've seen, it's done when they're hospitalized. But it takes a lot. That's the person that I had to write like 50 pages of notes and details. And the challenge is that a lot of times these consumers that really need conservatorship, they're going to county clinics that are overwhelmed. They have a lot of other stuff to do. And so the likelihood that a doctor is going to sit and write, that's just not going to happen. Not because the doctor's a jerk or whatever. It's very difficult. You have a lot of other demands. So they initiated a government agency. So family can't. And then it goes to court. And then they make a decision. What we have now that's kind of like institutions but different is IMDs, which are Institutes for Mental Disease. And so IMDs are locked facilities, but there's not very many, and they're very hard to get into. So like that person that I worked with that I got conservatorized, he had to stay at the inpatient psych unit for like 8 months before he got into an IMD. When they're in IMD, they don't have choices. And they usually improve vastly, but then you can't stay in IMD forever. And so then they get stepped down, and then, not all the time, but a lot of times you have people start to decompensate, stop taking the medicine, and then they're back again. And it becomes this like cycle. Because people have the right to self-determination, so they don't have to take their medicine. Unless the court orders it, no one has to take their medicine. Sometimes when doctors, psychiatrists talk to clients, they make it sound like they have to. You don't do anything. You do whatever you want. So, as a side note, in case I'm not teaching DSM or you don't take recovery, one thing that can be really helpful if you have consumers who really having a hard time meeting their own needs, having a hard time with compliance, maybe you're homeless, is to try to get injectable medication because they last for a month to 3 months and it's in their system. It's really hard when you're homeless to remember to take your medicine 4 times a day. Or if the medicine that you get knocks you out, then you might get killed or raped. So they have injectables that are long lasting. Because a lot of times people will be like, okay, I'll try medicine, and then 2 weeks later, like, screw you. But if it's already in them, then you're like, okay. And then in a couple more weeks, you can have that conversation again. They'll be like, okay, and they get another shot, and then they're like, screw you, but they already have the medicine in their system, which is good. So LPS conservatorships, they're limited, they're very controlled, and that's about it. So why don't you guys take...
So just to understand, so the first one, the person gives consent, and then the second one is like some doesn't even
So what I was saying in terms of what the texts say, in terms of practice, usually when I work with people that have conservators, they don't sign anything for consent. From what I've read, and when I was like studying for law and ethics, that technically they still can consent. So it's just kind of tricky. You don't get a lot of conservatorships, and a lot of times when people do need them, they're really not functioning. So you're not going to get someone that's like, like I remember one person, they were convinced they were a cell phone tower. So, like, if I'm like, I'm a cell phone tower. Okay. Maybe they sign. I'm not sure. Did they sign? No, we don't sign. Okay. So I guess if you have that, I would consult your agency because I've not seen that in practice a lot. And I've seen quite a few agencies where you do have conservatorships. You're not going to conservatorize, from that I'm aware of, like children or anything like that. It's adults. And what you might see a lot is people that maybe have significant disabilities where like they're never going to be able to make their own decisions. Like they have like, very, very severe delay or brain damage or something like that where it's actually not going to get better. Then they can put them on conservatorship. But you want to know what kind, because that dictates the kind of decisions they can make, the conservator, and the limitations. And so usually they have paperwork and they'll bring it. When they don't, it's usually not true, because it takes a lot to get it, especially LPS, but even probate, because the families have to do a lot to get it. So you guys can take a 15-minute break, and then when we come back, I'll go over some scenarios and help you guys connect what the legal or ethical issue is to those.